All right, here we go. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to The Graded Escape. I'm Anna.
I'm Kelley.
And today is our last episode in our 4-part series on the heart and science of reading. Today we're going to be talking about reading comprehension and critical thinking and how do you teach it. So we're really diving into one of the most important and overlooked parts of education, which is critical thinking.
Yeah, so critical thinking isn't just about memorizing facts, and that's why we really wanted to unpack it for everyone today, because when we think about reading and all of the work that we've already talked about that goes into teaching reading, as Anna said, this is the part that I think gets overlooked. So your kids are really fluent readers now. How do we encourage them to be really critical thinking? So it's being thoughtful about the questions that you're asking, analyzing information, making thoughtful decisions. So in today's episode, we're going to kind of unpack what is critical thinking and why it matters so much. And then we'll give you some practical strategies and examples that will that you can kind of apply on your own to just improve your overall teaching of reading comprehension.
Yeah, and critical thinking is definitely a key word. I mean, I think as educators, you're asked that a lot. Like I can remember when I was learning to become a teacher, that would be a word that was thrown out a lot by my advisors or my lead teacher or whatever. It was like, well, how can you tell that a child's, thinking critically about this? Or how can you gauge that or assess it or whatever? It was like always one of those like words that was thrown out to me a lot.
Definitely a buzzword.
Yeah, it was like
rigor.
Like rigor, right? There's certain words that come back into my head. And then even in my time now back in like universities delivering the lecture I do on the importance of children's literature, it's still, I can hear like from the students that when I'm sharing about children's books and I get to this slide about critical thinking, that a lot of them kind of look up because they're like, yep, nope, we're still drilled about critical thinking like right now. And yeah, how do you know what's happening and how do you enforce it and make it kind of fun and relatable to kids? And anyway, so critical thinking, it means a lot of different things really, but it's asking thoughtful questions when you're working with children. So depending on the age level, we're going to go through sort of a framework that can help you decipher what types of questions to be asking. But you want to be doing evaluating. You want to be thinking about bias or assumptions you have, perspectives, making decisions or judgments about stuff that you're reading, applying the learning that you've already done to new situations. So there's all different ways. It's not like, oh, that's critical thinking and that's not. It's sort of like an umbrella almost. Mm-hmm. And there's lots of different ways that you can apply a critical thinking technique to something that you're doing, something that you're working on. And it doesn't even just have to be about, sometimes people think critical thinking is just related to reading and writing, and it's not. I mean, there's lots of critical thinking when it comes to math or science or other
history even.
Other things like that. So we have a specific template that we're going to discuss and we'll put it up on the screen for you to look at too, called Bloom's taxonomy, that Kelley's going to just introduce. But that's going to help lead our conversation in the ways that you can utilize that framework to figure out where you are on that pyramid with your own kids, if you're homeschooling, or if you're a teacher, where they are in your classroom, and ways to create the best types of thought-provoking critical thinking questions to apply to whatever you're doing.
Yeah. So chances are, if you have any sort of background in education, you've probably heard of Bloom's taxonomy, and if you haven't, that's totally okay. So it's very thoughtfully named after Benjamin Bloom and a group of collaborating educators and psychologists. The first version was published in 1956, and really its purpose was to develop a common language and framework for classifying learning objectives. So how do we help kids become critical thinkers, and how do we help teachers facilitate that type of thinking? So it is shaped like a pyramid, and again, the pyramid will be up, and you need to start at the bottom and build your way up. Mm-hmm. So it's a very natural structure, but you do want to kind of make sure that you definitely are starting at the base and building from there, because as you'll see, the bottom tier is really thinking about, can students remember and recall basic facts and concepts? And again, this doesn't have to be within reading only. It can be science or math. So if you're thinking about an example of that, it would be like asking your child to retell a story or recite key facts. If you're doing like science or a history lesson or something like that. So that's like your base, right? You can't really do too much else There's some little things that you could do, but you really need to make sure that there's that basic level of comprehension. Can they recall the information that they just read or that they were just taught? So that's your first one.
Yeah. And if you're little, like you're reading to your 4-year-old, your 5-year-old, I mean, you can be asking these sorts of questions like, oh, I forgot the character's name. What was it again? Or something like that. I mean, it's very, I mean, you can be using it with any kind of material that, that you're using in the moment. It doesn't have to be a separate, we're doing a critical thinking lesson today. That's very rarely how it's ever. It shouldn't be like that because it needs to be worked in with what you're doing. So I think that comes up a lot with homeschooling moms that I know who have little ones that are like, well, we read a lot, but I don't know what to ask, or I don't know, like, should I be doing more with the books? You're always saying read, but do I just read and put the book down? And it's like, well, you can, but that's a prime time that you can be starting to implement some of these tiered levels on the pyramid that you can see on your screen. And so, like Kelley said, the first one is remembering. Can they recall basic facts or details? And
I think too, just to I do think a lot of people, if you are asking questions while your child is reading, this is typically what people think, right? Like, what's the setting? Who are the characters? Maybe what was the problem? What was the solution? How did the story end? Those types of things. Yeah. And there'll be another one too, but like some of the other ones, this will fall under a different category. It's like, okay, basic facts, and then like, oh, well, what did you think of this story? Did you like it? Right. What was your favorite part? Those are kind of the two, like, that I think of people who are maybe, not educators. Those are the two types of questions that they ask. Right. So, and those are great questions. And we're just here to kind of help expand and give you some more options for different questions that you can ask in those moments. Okay. So go ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you don't want to, I think sometimes people can fall back on like doing this remembering one to death, where it's like, well, I always ask them to recall facts from the story. When a kid knows how to do that, that can be a very like boring thing to continually ask them to do. So I feel like, because it is a pyramid and you're working your way up, it's not like you always need to go back to the remembering and, your child remembers things from the story. You've worked on that, and now you're continuing to ask them to remember little facts. Yeah. You don't need to do that as they, because think of working up the pyramid. You can, you can throw that in, but it doesn't need to be
so explicit.
Because that'll get kids to be sort of like, why do you keep asking me?
I know who the character is. Especially if you're reading like a chapter book or something, right? Like the character doesn't change from like chapter 1 to chapter 5, or maybe new characters come. But and then again, like, because it is a pyramid, right? Each one underneath is kind of, because it does build on it, right? Like if you're asking a higher level question, they have to have some knowledge, right? They have to be able to recall who the characters are. So once you feel pretty confident in that, you can start with a higher level question. And if it's not going well, then maybe I would scale it back and go back to just like, okay, well, hang on a second. Like, who was the character again? What's the problem? And then if they can't answer that, then you can kind of scaffold from there.
Exactly. Okay. So going up the Bloom's taxonomy pyramid, you're going to see the next one being understanding. So now you're looking to see, you're moving on from just recalling facts or details. You're now seeing if your child can explain in their own words what's going on. So maybe they're retelling the story using their own language. You've done a science experiment and they're kind of summarizing it for you and giving you sort of the gist of it. And they're showing a deeper level of comprehending what's going on, not just pulling a detail or pulling a fact. They're now using some of their own language in the conversation more so. Slowly up the
and you can see too on the pyramid, it'll give you some like key words for each one. So like, obviously it says explain ideas or content. So like they're classifying, describing, discussing, explaining, identifying, locating, recognizing, reporting, selecting. So there's like those key words that kind of will help you develop your questions. But really that's basically what it is. Can they, without having to read verbatim from the text, can they explain what happened in their own words? And again, it seems like, if they can remember it, then they can understand it. And not necessarily. Sometimes kids have a little bit of a hard time with this next step, and you'll ask like, tell me like what the problem was, and they'll go back and they'll maybe just like read word for word, and you'll have to say, well, no, tell me,
but why was that a problem?
Right. Like think about, why was that a problem? Or tell me in your own words. Summarizing is a really nice way to do it, right? Like beginning, middle, and end, because then the kids really have to condense all of the facts. Like, they've remembered all the facts, now they have to condense it into what happened in the beginning, the middle, and the end. And a lot of times, authors obviously won't write like in the beginning, like this happened, and then in the middle this happened. So they do have to create their own summary. We do this a little bit with our curriculum with Pinwheels, as there's pictures, and they do give a picture of all of the they give a picture of all of the things that happened in their little reader, and then they have to group them in the beginning, or first, next, then last. And then they use that to kind of make a little summary. So, they have all of the pictures, but then when they go to write their summary, they can't like verbatim say like this happened and then this happened, and they're not rewriting the story. You're just summarizing it. So
or if you think of an example of a story like a girl who has, I don't know, lost her cat or whatnot, and a remembering type question where they could remember that the story is about a girl who's she's sad because she lost her cat. So now an understanding level question would be bringing like, well, why would that make her sad? And you're asking, like, what types of emotions might she be feeling? Why is that? Well, then they have to go on to a little bit more of explaining why losing her cat in the story is making her feel this way, and then maybe even pulling in some stuff from the story that shows that she's feeling sad, the way she's acting or talking, or even using the illustrations. And so just showing a deeper understanding, which goes into applying, which is the third one up on the tier. So you're halfway there, where they're using the knowledge in new context. So thinking of that same example with the story of a girl who's lost her cat, now, you could pull in another question that says something like, gosh, have you felt sad like that? Or has there been a situation where, you might have felt a similar way? Or, oh, wow, I wonder how you would have handled this if this happened in our family. Or you're starting to now kind of pull in this from the story or the activity. You're kind of having them reframe it in a different context. So taking it out of the framework of the book that they've read it in, or the activity you've just done, and applying it to something else. So which can seem tricky, but again, the pyramid's really great because, as Kelley said, it uses some really great keywords that you can try to put into your questioning. So for apply, it's like they're demonstrating, interpreting, sketching, implement, solve. They're doing a bit more as they work up the step. They're doing a bit more as far as sharing how much they're thinking about the story or the activity. Right.
And I think too, don't get so hung up on like, where does this question fit, right? Like, so the goal again of us sharing all this information isn't for you to be like, I really need to be asking some more analyzing questions. Right. It's just to be like, how can you be more thoughtful in your questions? And if you can't, discriminate, well, did I just ask an evaluate question, which we'll get to, or was that an apply question, or was that an understand question? It doesn't matter, right? Like the goal is to just increase and come up with different ways to ask your learners something about what they've read outside of, who's the character, what was the setting.
Right. And because in this homeschool, way of teaching, you have that ability because you're working with just your one child or two child or whatever. And so these conversations are such a huge part of homeschooling, which I feel like every week that goes by, I'm learning more and more to scrap like old school, like classroom things. And it's just more about how many conversations that I had with my kids today about things. And that's why it's so beautiful, because it's true. In the classroom, you do need to sometimes show evidence of specific levels that a child's been able to attain within this framework. But when you're homeschooling, if you're talking, like if I'm reading a book to my two kids, and so I have a son who's 7 and one who's 5, and we've just read a story, and I'm asking questions about it. My older son, I'll keep going on, and he'll keep giving me more because he's older, and so as my other one's listening to the questions and sometimes chimes in with his thoughts, which is great. But then my older one, Leo, is like going up to that next level of analyzing, whereas my younger one is still kind of showing me understanding of the story. But it just kind of comes out if you're throwing out more and more questions, and they're starting to look at you like, you've probably gone too far up the you're getting too analytical at this point, or you're asking too much, and so you just want to gauge it. But being able to be comfortable with reading with your kids and asking, that's kind of the whole point of this entire episode, is really trying to get you to feel comfortable with having more and more conversation dialogue with your kids around what you're doing, whether it's reading a story, doing a math problem, like what, and how to ask more tailored, challenging questions to ultimately attain that feeling of, yes, we're doing a lot of critical thinking in our schedule.
Yeah.
So, don't be bogged down with like, wait, what kind of question was that? It's just that there's lots of different types of questions and they can all lead you to the ultimate goal.
Right.
Thinking critically.
Did you ever have to, in your lesson plans, put like what level of Bloom's taxonomy? Because I remember having to do that. Just like what level question.
Yep. Or even with like assessing a student and seeing where they were able to, like how far they were able to go when it came to like asking questions. Like up there, she's really stuck on the understanding level. I'm not able to do many applying questions. This is where they're getting stuck. And I mean, it was very intentional. And then you're seeing like, but again, that's part of the beauty of why when you homeschool is that it ebbs and flows with this pyramid, and there doesn't need to be such a pressure on attaining a certain level of comprehension at that time.
I need to make sure I ask a question from every level of Bloom's taxonomy. No, it kind of comes up.
It just comes naturally. So we've gone through remembering, understanding, applying. Yeah. We're up to now analyzing. So this is drawing connections among ideas. So break information into parts, looking for patterns or relationships. So this is a lot of when you're so when you think about like analysis or analyzing anything, you're usually making comparisons. And you're usually starting to like think about either a relationship between something, either characters in the story, or maybe they're making connections to something outside. I can remember this was one of my actually observed lessons. So for any teachers watching, and those wonderful observed lessons where you're being watched by who knows how many people, and I've been on both sides of that, and it's always uncomfortable. But I can remember doing one that was on Bloom's taxonomy analyzing type level, but it was called text to text, text to self, and text to world. And it was where they, I was reading a story and they were making these connections, whether it was to another book, they were from the book I read to another book, a connection to themselves from the book that I read, or another world connection. And that really was highlighting that analysis, like could they analyze at that point. But I think that analyzing, for me, my favorite types of analyzing questions, or when we get to that point, are a lot about characters, like motives, their intentions behind what they're doing, or their relationships. And I think that's a really fun place to get to. And I think a lot of kids can actually do this earlier than you'd think, because relationships tend to be something kids pick up on quickly in stories. And so I've felt like analyzing types of questions or patterns in behaviors or things. Those are sometimes my favorite conversations to have, are about the characters and relationships. But that's sort of that analyzing level.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So then our next one is evaluating, which is being able to make judgments based on criteria or logic. So now you're sort of working your way up towards the top of the pyramid. And this is where it's kind of nice. And again, I think kids can do this. Honestly, I think kids can do a lot of these at an earlier age.
I don't think, I know, because I was thinking in my head, I do think that I was sort of taught this framework as sort of like, age, like this is the age remembering, this is the age, and I purposely didn't put in any ages in the notes that we're referring to, but I also, I'm really glad now that I didn't, because I think you could align all these with ages, but I think that would take away some of, because you don't want to stifle a kid's ability to talk more about it by not asking for the questions if it seems like it's appropriate.
It's a read aloud, So if you've taken, even for a younger learner or a struggling learner, or whatever, you've taken like having to decode and actually read off the table, and now it's more of like a listening comprehension. I think that kids can definitely do this at a younger age. So making judgments, based on some sort of criteria. Do you think the character made the right choice? Why or why not? Do you think that this other character thought that character made the right choice? Why or not? So now you're kind of really unpacking some trickier and critical thinking, and you can see how it's building, So if you're trying to decide or evaluate if a character made the right choice, first of all, you have to know who the character is, You have to know what choice they made, and then you have to go a little bit beyond that and think about what were the implications of the choice that character made. And then now you've got some analyzing, And they're making a connection as to maybe their own life or another book and why that, or something else that happened in the story. So it all builds together for sure. And I think the higher the question, I think the more fun, and definitely the more varied answers that you're going to get. As you get higher on Bloom's taxonomy, there's less and less of a correct answer, right? Like remembering who's the character. There's really only one, you can say who's the main character, and maybe they give you like a secondary character. So, but there's typically like a right answer, and as you get higher, there really isn't, which is kind of nice because it fosters that conversation. And if a kid kind of says something like, "Oh, well, you're thinking, no, the character really didn't make a good choice," but then your learner says like, "Oh no, I think they did," and then you have the opportunity to like, "Oh, wow, okay, well, why? Why do you think that?" And they might have a really great explanation as to why, and that's totally fine. So I think, the higher you get on the pyramid, the less and less it becomes about getting the right answer, and it's more just having these types of conversations and teaching kids to think a little bit differently about what's being read to them, what they're reading, what they're doing for science, all of that kind of stuff. So
when you hear evaluating too, I also think about like a science experiment, and you're kind of evaluating, they're not just remembering what they used or what the point of the experiment was, but now they're evaluating, how did it go? Could they make changes to it? Things like that. What
would you do different next time?
Right. If you're looking at, even solving a math problem, and they're evaluating the way that they went about solving it. Was there another way you could have solved it? Could you have done something different? Like they're starting. So it's just a way of getting them to think about what they're doing, really, instead of just sort of a robotic, I got to do this because it's math time, or with the very thoughtless sort of just getting the output there, or solve it, getting the paragraph written or getting the response written down or whatnot. It's trying to promote this intentionality around thinking about what we're doing, and that just goes across every framework of, every subject in school, really. Which ultimately you get to creating. And again, when you think about ages, there's kids that are creating work that are in kindergarten that are doing this creating because it's, it's appropriate for that activity whatever project they're doing. It's based off of their age, but they can create things in kindergarten. So creating is producing something original that's, based off of the ideas that you had come up with. And so, or the ideas that you've learned, whether it was reading the story or doing an activity or whatnot, but now you're creating something on your own. So like an example, writing an alternate ending to a story, inventing something like a tool or a game, even creating a piece of art, based off of things you learned about an artist or a certain style of art, so it's, but it's creating something new based off of stuff that you've learned. And whether that's a writing thing or not, it's, it's up to what you're doing. But that's kind of the pinnacle, is being able to now make something that's your own. And again, that could be done at any age.
Because you could just have them draw like, "Oh no, the book ended. Like, let's draw a picture of what you think might happen next," or like, "Let's pretend the author wants to have like 2 more pages. What would go on those 2 pages, right?" And then you can kind of see what the child comes up with, because ideally, they're going to use the information from the story that they've already heard about, and then they're going to make a picture that sort of takes the story a little bit further. And then again, if you're getting, a child that, let's say it's about that missing cat, right? And they're drawing, I don't know, an elephant or something that has nothing to do with it, then okay, well, maybe we need to, maybe we need to go back. Is this like they're not understanding what happened? But again, it just guides your conversation, and it's not necessarily that they're wrong. Like if a kid drew a picture of an elephant as the end, the next couple pages for a story about a cat, I would just ask them like, "Oh, so what are you thinking here?
This is a new character that comes in at the end of
tell me about why there's an elephant," and then they might come up with a really great idea that has all of this information that they're thinking that they just obviously didn't put in the picture. So again, like there's no real right or wrong answer when you get, past really the remembering part. Understanding maybe a little bit too, but
and one way to really sort of drive this home as far as giving you like an example would be, and I used to do this because I can remember when I was teaching 3rd grade, and it was such a pivotal year, as I probably said on here before, but about where for most of the students, they were no longer learning how to read. They were reading to learn. And so we would talk a lot about rigor. That was a fun word that came up. And it was really encouraged that I share with parents a lot about what reading looked like and how questions became more rigorous or more high on the Bloom's chart, if they had known what that was, which some of them might have. But I actually gave this example of Charlotte's Web because it's such a well-known book, and where I actually worked as a third grade teacher, and that was a story that was read in second grade. So the parents coming in would always know about that particular book. So when we would use Charlotte's Web as an example, a remembering level question would be like, who are the main characters? You've got Charlotte, you got Wilbur, those, it's a yes or no, right or wrong kind of question.
Right, exactly.
Up then as you go up, understanding. So why did Charlotte help Wilbur? So it doesn't say anywhere in the book why she helped him. That has to come from their kind of making inferences about who she was and what her personality was like, her affection for Wilbur, right? That would be an understanding question. Going up, applying would be, how do you help a friend in a similar situation? So now you're pulling that entire relationship out and trying to have them identify a time in their lives that they might have had a similar situation. Analyzing, how does the author use language to make Charlotte seem wise? So that would be, they're having to really dissect her personality in the story and, having to go into their background knowledge about what does it mean to be wise and, would they characterize her as wise or not? You could use a different word or they could even choose their own word to describe Charlotte, but they have to back it up with, reasons for why they think that the author, is portraying her this way. And so, it gets harder. Evaluating, was Charlotte right to deceive the humans the way that she did? So now you're bringing their own perspective about it, really having to factor in other evidence from the story and really making a pretty big judgment or opinion at that point. And then creating, like we had talked about, writing a new chapter where Wilbur helps another animal, or they could just create another chapter that's kind of on their own. But so looking at the scope of different types of questions, those are all hitting very different levels of critical thinking.
Right.
And would you ever do all of this at once? Absolutely not.
Right.
You're never running through the whole, Bloom's taxonomy period. But the goal is to remember that when you're reading with your children, when you're homeschooling, doing anything with your children, that the asking of questions and the framing of questions is just so important in order to create an atmosphere of critical thinking. It sounds like we both had, other parents ask us, like, what do you ask your kids or how do you have those conversations going? And that's why this pyramid we thought would be so important to share with you today as a way to be thinking about the kinds of questions you're asking with your homeschooler.
Yeah, I think too, and I don't know if it fits anywhere else in what we're going to talk about, but I think one of the things that is a very heavy emphasis right now, or at least it was when I was in Fall River, is this idea of like, well, where's your evidence, right? When you're answering a question, how do you know? Where's your evidence? Go back into the text. Almost to the point where, like, now as I say it, I'm like, I don't even ask my kids that. But there is some truth to it, right? So if you're struggling as far as like asking questions, right? So one of the ones would be like, was Charlotte right or to deceive the humans, right? So the kids would give an answer, and then you would ideally want them to give some sort of evidence in the story to kind of back that up. If you're really looking to kind of challenge them a little bit more, so you can kind of tie it back to the story. Or if you're asking, like, why did Charlotte help Wilbur? And right, the author doesn't say Charlotte decided to help Wilbur because like there's things in the story that we kind of naturally pick up on that authors do to, make their readers kind of understand where they're coming from. So you can ask, your learner, like, well, okay, how do you know? And it can be very simple like that. You don't have to say, like, where's your evidence?
Right. How do you know?
Just say, how do you know? What does the author, I like to bring it back to the author, because then when they're writing, I'm like, you get to be the author. Yeah. But anyway, so like, what does the author tell us? And then we kind of go back together and we look, and we do this a lot with like character traits. So if we're talking about, like, we just read, one of the books, Magic Treehouse, Dinosaurs Before Dark, the first one. And one of our little activities was to pick a character and talk about their traits, right? So like, I'll ask like, okay, well, what kind of, character is Jack? And so then Owen, I think, said he was smart. I'm like, okay, great. Well, how do you know he's smart, right? And then it's like, oh, because he always has a book in his backpack, or he's, reading the facts. All right, great. Like, that's fine. But it just pushing them just a little bit to support their answer. And it doesn't have to be written. It can obviously just be a conversation, but like just pushing them a little bit to find information in that text, or in your science experiment or in your math problem. Like, okay, so how do you know is a big, is a really nice question to kind of have in your back pocket, so that it will push them a little further, so that kids, you know, they're just like, oh, well, they're nice. Because that's a big one, right? Oh, well, Annie's nice. Okay. How do you know? And kids could say, and my kids could say anything, right? Like they could say, you know, she's rude. And I would say like, okay, how do you know? Because you don't know what they're inferring from the story.
Right.
And it's just, I want to make sure that they understand what they're doing, right? You're not just making up words to describe a character,
right?
And that they're being a little bit more thoughtful about how they're describing them and using some support from the story.
Right. Yeah, and that's going back to that intentionality around, right, they're not just throwing out a word to answer you because they want to move on. Right. They're actually having to really think about why they chose that word and what's the meaning behind choosing that word. And I almost think it gets easier. If you had little kids at home and you read a lot of picture books, you know, I love referencing illustrations, you know, with kids too. And sometimes when they're like, oh, they're feeling this way, even though they didn't say that, I'll say, well, how do you know that? Or what makes you feel that way? And they look at the picture or they start talking about the pictures. And so using these types of questions, you know, if you're thinking, well, my kids are too little, we don't even read chapter books yet or anything like that. These questions can be discussed during picture books and utilizing those illustrations, and sometimes even using wordless text, wordless picture books are really fun.
Are fun
to you know, to practice, because you're forced to kind of come up with your, you know, they're getting all their ideas from just the illustrations. They don't have the text to fall back on, so it can be really fun. But you don't have to wait until your child is reading chapter books or anything like that. You can be doing this anytime. You can be doing these types of questions when you're baking, like you said, when they're doing, you know, a math problem and they've solved it. Well, how do you know that's the right answer? That goes back to why teachers used to say, can you check your work, right? Like, show me another way to do it so that you've checked your work so you know the answer is right. It's just always trying to take that step further. Are they thinking about what they're doing, versus just like I said, a robotic type of doing it because it's the assignment, I gotta get it done. Are they actually thinking about what they're doing and ways to show that thinking? So that's really what critical thinking is. And hopefully this Bloom's taxonomy framework will be helpful for you when it comes to creating questions. But the other thing that we wanted to really pay a little bit of time sharing with you, or pay attention to rather, is giving you some real strategies to promote this critical thinking, you know, culture in your house. And we've said a lot about, you know, reading and asking questions during those times when you are, you know, asking questions is probably, I would say, the best ways to kind of pull out critical thinking topics, because you're having conversation and discussing. But there are some other ways that you can be more intentional about creating a dynamic or a culture in your homeschool space, or just your household, whatever, that's promoting critical thinking. And so, you know, we have a few different examples that we're going to share. The first one that is really important and very powerful is modeling thinking aloud and what that looks like. So showing your thought process. So when they see you model that, like you're thinking about something and you're asking more questions, and they hear you're going through that reasoning in your head, then they start to sometimes they see that process, and so then they can kind of emulate it a little bit better because they've thought of it. And so I can remember, like the other day we were baking something and I couldn't find the type of measuring spoon that I needed, and so I was like thinking out loud about like, well, what 2 measuring spoons could I do in order to get to the same amount? Because I couldn't find the cup anywhere, but could I do 2 of the half cups? Or I could do, you know, like I was trying to problem solve in my head a different way to get, you know, the result that I needed. And so I could have just done that all in my head, but I was doing the activity with my kids. So I just started to share out loud what I was thinking and how I ended up getting to my conclusion. And so that was an example of just modeling thinking aloud. So that's a good one too.
Yeah, and it can be in any sort of activity. I think, that's a good one. Baking is a really good example. If you're trying to solve a problem and you're not really sure how to do it, and it's not necessarily like, it doesn't necessarily have to be like, oh, I'm going to intentionally do this to try to help my kids get to the right answer. It can genuinely be like, oh, I'm not really sure how to do this. Let me try this again.
Or I'm wondering about this, or I'm, you know, just but being willing to to speak it out loud. Because you're
right.
asking them to do that all the time.
Yeah.
But if they haven't seen it modeled, it's hard. I mean, that's a hard thing to do.
Yeah.
I mean, that goes across the board for a lot of things with kids. We expect a lot for them to do a lot of things that haven't been modeled for them. And I think modeling really helps.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, sometimes I'll do it too if I like don't have an ingredient. I mean, baking's such a good example, but if I don't have like an ingredient, I'm like, oh shoot, what can I use as like a substitute for this? And then I have to Google it, but that's fine. Like even like modeling that, like asking Google for, you know, support in, you know, your baking, your baking endeavors. Okay, and then we talked a lot about, you know, types of questions, as far as Bloom's taxonomy, but also just kind of keeping in mind of some open-ended questions. So just little tweaks in the types of questions that you're asking. So an open-ended question is really one where the child has an opportunity to respond that isn't just like yes or no, or like an exact specific, you know, answer. You could say, I mean, you could try to avoid some yes and no questions like, oh, was, you know, Bob the main character? And they'd be like, yeah. Right. You could just literally switch it up to, who was the main character? And then they would say Bob, right? So like just a little tweak like that is a good place to kind of start if you're feeling really uncomfortable with opening-ended questions. But some other ones would be like, what do you think would happen if, or why do you think the author chose this, or how would you solve this differently? Or like even, I mean, examples in like science or baking would be like, what do you think would happen if we put like double the amount of like flour in, or double the amount of this in? Like, what do you think would happen? And then if it's something you can safely do, maybe not with your baking, but like in science, like let's try it and see, you know, what happens. How would you solve this differently? What's a different way of explaining that? So just, again, trying to avoid those or trying to do a little bit more than those very basic, like close-ended, this is the right answer, okay, now we move on. Just promoting more, you know, just conversation really about what it is that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Another one is to encourage a lot of debate and discussion. So these questions lead to a lot of this, which is why we've harped on questions so much. But if you have, I mean, depending on how many kids you have at home, or you know, even if it's just the one, but like you could use even dinner if you're a family that sits down for dinner, you know, together, and that's a great time to have these discussions and conversations. But you know, you can really throw out anything. I think kids actually often like too, I found in my years in the classroom, they do really enjoy debating, going back and forth, even not in like a formal debating, like they don't even realize that they're like doing debate. But you know, where, you know, you think of a story like the Three Little Pigs, you know, was the wolf really a bad guy in that story? Do you think he misunderstood, you know? And then one kid takes a perspective of, yeah, he was. The other one says, no, he's not. And before you know it, there's this really lively, you know, banter going back and forth about this. And it's just turned into a real fun dinner discussion or whatnot. I used to love having debates and discussions in the classroom. And I do think, you know, if you were to step into a classroom, one that has the most conversations going on would be, in my opinion, a better classroom than one that's quiet and not having that go on, because that's where I think the best learning happens is through those conversations and discussions. And, you know, encouraging debate, throwing out different points of views, even playing around with, you know, even if you have to be the devil's advocate sometimes and throw out something that you know your kids are going to respond to, like, what, are you crazy? Like, why would you, you know, like if you said something I don't know what I to eat. Right. Or like, I just, you know, I don't really like this. I don't really like Christmas or something like that. You know, and be like, oh, you and now all of a sudden they're going through, I mean, every example that they can think of why Christmas is such a wonderful holiday, you know, like, but and I'm kind of goading them a little bit with, you know, my responses to see how much of a debate we can get going or discussion. And, you know, all of that's just really powerful and really wonderful to do. So encouraging debates. And
it also teaches a little bit of like perspective taking too. Like if you're having a debate, you have to think about the other person's perspective, you know, as far as like, oh, well, and you have to actually actively listen. I think that's the other piece that's really important to, you know, a debate, and this idea of like respectful disagreement and like, okay, well, hold on, like, you know, like Owen's talking right now, Grace, you need to wait, and you actually need to listen to what he has to say before you move on with your piece. And I do think that that's really, you know, a powerful thing. It teaches more than just the critical thinking. It teaches these other skills too, of like perspective taking and active listening. So then another one would be, and this is really a nice one because as homeschoolers, we get these really authentic opportunities, is to integrate real life problem solving. So we talked about cooking, right? Like using that to talk about cause and effect, measurement, experimentation, things like, budgeting. That's math right there, right? Like, well, we only have this many dollars, or
decision making, right?
Yeah,
so you only have this much. Can we get that, or can we get that?
Right,
like which do we need type of thing.
Prioritizing. Talking about current events, at whatever level you're comfortable within your own home. Evaluating sources. The kids have this really fun, I wish I could remember the name of it. I'll have to ask them. It was this really fun graphic novel about like fake news. And I didn't get too far into it because I just kind of saw it and was like, what is this? And like, it taught them essentially like how to evaluate sources, but like in a fun, like graphic-y novel. And thinking about like, okay, well, you heard this or you saw this. Like, what do you think about that? Like, do you think that that's actually something that's, happening? Owen's really into Bigfoot right now, and like Loch Ness Monster and the Yeti, and so he'll ask me like, Mom, do you actually think like Bigfoot is real? Or, oh, I know what's real. Loch Ness Monster is real.
Yeah.
And I'll say like, oh, well, why do you think that? And he's like, well, because there's this picture, and I'm like, oh, I don't know. That kind of looks like a branch to me, or that kind of looks like maybe somebody, altered that picture. I mean, this was obviously. The picture was taken way before like AI and all that kind of stuff. But now, again, with AI, like really thinking a little more critically about what you're, what kids are, seeing and exposing to, and to really teach them how to think critically and not take necessarily just because they saw it, on the internet or, on your phone or something like that doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. Like, how do we figure that out,
Right. When you think about it, in today's day and age with the critical thinking, it's almost a more pivotal, important skill that be, practiced than ever before, just with how much is out there and having people think for themselves instead of being told, certain things and believing it at face value, or because, we're told things left and right that don't make sense. And then, so can you craft your own opinion that, so starting at this early stage of doing this with our, in our everyday lives as homeschoolers, which is just such a gift. And working it into our school. Project-based learning is probably another one of those words. I hear it and I'm just like, it's not a trigger, but it's like I don't know. Some schools really, go on and on about, that they do all this project-based learning and all that stuff, and it's wonderful and yada yada. And it is project-based learning, which is you're showing what you've learned based off of like by creating a project, doing a project on it. So it's showing learning in a different way versus sitting down and answering questions on a test. You're creating something. So it is great. I'm not saying it's not great, but it's for a while there it was like everything was like it was like unless you could make it a project-based learning initiative or something, it was like not going to be looked at. And I do love projects to do with kids. Like I don't know if I mentioned on here before, but like one of my favorite things to do, I remember once in third grade was instead of doing like a book report or a test after a book that we had read, they created game boards based off
I remember you saying
the book.
that.
It was such a wonderful project because gosh, it showed the setting, it showed the characters, it showed they had to create questions and answers from the story. It was a wonderful way to gauge their comprehension of the story that we had read and put their own spin on it. And it was wonderful. So those project-based opportunities are great, and schools do, I think, try to do more of that. So yay, if your kids are in a school and they're doing a lot of project-based learning, that's great. It can't be utilized or done anywhere near as much as a homeschooler can do it, which is but promoting projects at really all levels, because a project it almost takes in every level of the
Bloom's taxonomy.
Bloom's taxonomy, because it goes everything from remembering up to creating, because there's so many different steps in a project when you're making something, and all the steps you have to go through and how much you have to think about when you're creating a project. So using more project-based learning opportunities for your kids, and that could be a whole other episode on ways to come up with projects, or you can but you can also find projects on almost anything, but something that's more project based. There's more elements to it than just sitting and writing or just sitting and there's a lot, or answering a question. There's a lot more thought that has to go into it, and the more thought that has to go into something, the more likely you're getting towards that critical thinking level of where you want to be. So projects
do it.
Yeah, do them.
And then just reflecting often. So, after each activity or reading, asking some reflection questions, it also keeps kids engaged, right? And feel like they're a part of it. Things like, oh, what did you learn that surprised you? Or, do you have any questions left? I remember there was a book that I was reading over the summer, and I really did not like the ending. And the kid, I remember closing the book and being like, I really don't like how that ended. And the kids were like, well, why? I was like, because this question, I still have this question. What happened about this? What happened about that? Right? Yeah. So even as an adult, I still have questions after maybe reading something. If you're thinking about designing, if they designed an experiment, maybe it didn't go well, right? If you could do it again, what would you change? What would you do differently? Or if you think the character could go back in time, what would they do differently? So, reflecting upon a project or reflecting upon something that they've read, it really encourages them to think about their own thinking. What did you think of this story? Would you like to read another one like this? Why or why not? Right. So it just encourages some of that self-reflection.
And self-reflection is something I think is not done anywhere near enough for anybody, but it's it also shows this real interest. I think kids really have a sense of that you care when you're asking more about them to think about what they've just done or accomplished or worked on or whatnot. And so I like the term of metacognition, because reflection builds metacognition, which is the ability to think about one's own thinking. About one's own thinking. And so it's and we don't always, especially kids, a lot of times they're just on the race to get to the answer or the race to finish. So to stop and think and go back about how hard this was. About one's own thinking. What was I just going to say?
It's not done nearly enough.
No. Yeah, it's not done, it's not done nearly enough. And I think that when kids do take the time to evaluate or think about their own learning, right, they end up making tweaks in either their approach to the next activity, or that you can bring that into conversation the next time and remember we did it this way before and that was hard, and so they're really starting to have a better and deeper sense of self in the way that they learn and the way they understand self-awareness. I used to love, one of my favorite things to put on the end of tests was and I did not come up with this myself, I saw it somewhere, I wish I could remember where, but I used to put, when I gave tests at school, because I had to, the last question on all my tests, whether it was a science test, a writing thing, whatever, I used to be is there anything else you'd like to tell me I didn't ask you? And there would be times that kids would write so much after that question. So maybe it had been a whole test on Anne Frank, because we had read Anne Frank in 5th grade or something, and there was a bunch of written responses, some multiple choice, whatever, and then that would be the question at the end, and then I would get paragraphs about maybe their feelings about Anne Frank, or a dream they had about it, or I would just get all this rich stuff about their experience with this story and this character and this historical time in history, and that was magic, and I wouldn't have gotten that had I not left that question on the test. And I used to count it heavily, because sometimes even if they weren't a great test taker when it came to picking multiple choice or whatever, but then I would see what they wrote in this next piece, and I was like, oh my gosh, but this is showing me so much of what I know. And I used to be blown away by that, and I loved adding that piece in, and there was that self-reflection in it too. Sometimes they would write about I really didn't like this experiment, or I thought this science thing was really tough. I still don't really feel like I get it, but they would be they would be very honest a lot of times in that, because it wasn't they couldn't get that one wrong. They were just writing something. So I loved it. So there's lots of ways to create this critical thinking culture at home. Just praising that curiosity and effort. We're not looking for just right answers, you would talk to. Encouraging those mistakes and showing those that you make mistakes too. That's a big one in my household, because my kids are perfectionists and don't like to make mistakes, and as am I, so that makes sense, right? Right. I do love the idea of a question wall. I don't know if you've heard of that one before, or a journal where your child adds just questions that they have about things. I did that, I think the first year that we were homeschooling. I had this area with sticky notes that whenever they thought I had a question about something, and we would put it up there and we'd slowly kind of work our way through them. But that was a fun way. I didn't keep doing it. I don't remember what, but I did do it one year. I thought about maybe doing that again, but
Yeah.
question wall.
Good idea. We used to do, if you're a teacher and you haven't heard of it, I think it's a I can't remember, a responsive classroom strategy. It's called the parking lot. I don't know if you ever did that, where kids like ask a question that doesn't have anything to do with what, like, I think Owen would be a parking lot kid, where he would ask questions that have something to do with what you're talking about, but you can't answer it right then. They put it on a sticky and put it in the parking lot, and you go back to it and answer it later, because it's a way to honor the fact that they asked a question rather than just shutting them down and being like, we're not talking about that right now. That has nothing to do with. So like, the question wall is very similar to like a parking lot. Of like, okay, well, I'm in the middle of the dishes. Like, why don't you put that in the parking lot and answer it some other time. Yeah.
So I hope that this episode has helped unpack critical thinking a little bit for you. We gave you a lot of information, and take your time if you want to look over that Bloom's taxonomy pyramid, because that's just really helpful. It was helpful for me. I remember as a teacher, and just working in more questions throughout your day. Ultimately, hopefully it gave you a little more confidence in what to ask your child or how to build it into.
For sure. Yeah.
So until next time, we hope you keep the lessons light and the moments meaningful.
And thanks for escaping with us.